Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I know some more folks will be making their way into our virtual space, but we are super excited to have you all here this morning for this FAFSA training for all of you who help our students with the complicated process of completing their FAFSA. So thanks for making time to join us this morning. I'm Kathy Mcdonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships at the Florida College Access Network. First, I want to extend a profound thanks to our partners who are helping to make this training possible. The Florida Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, the Florida Office of Student Financial Assistance, and the Florida School Counselor Association, who all worked collaboratively to bring this training to the fold this morning. So super grateful for everyone who participated and all the folks working behind the scenes to help make this possible. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. First, we welcome your questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A section on your dashboard. We have many folks, financial aid experts behind the scenes, ready and willing and waiting to answer your questions. So you can submit those at any time. We will allow some time at the end, but if we see some questions that are timely in the middle of things, we'll go ahead and take those right away. So please go ahead and submit those in the Q&A section. Finally, as some of you heard when you were on at the beginning, this session is being recorded. We will make that recording available on the FCAN Florida FAFSA Challenge page of our website. That'll typically go up within a couple of days. So if you want to listen to it again or share it with a colleague, you'll be able to refer back to that whenever you wish. Now with that, I am super excited to welcome FAFSA, the Financial Aid Administrators Association President, Katie Conrad, who's going to help us get started. So Katie, let me stop sharing my screen. Whoops, let me get out of that. Stop share, there we go. So that way, if you want to share something and if you can take it from here, welcome, we're excited to have you.
Well, good morning. It's so good to have all of you here with us virtually today. And I wanted to start by thanking our partners at FCAN and OSPA and the Florida School Counselor Association. As Kathy said, that this truly is a collaborative effort among all of these organizations. As financial aid administrators, we understand how important it is for the high school counselors to have the best information about financial aid and about the application process. A couple of years back, our association began working with FCAN to ensure that you all receive the training that you need to assist your students. And today's training is a result of that partnership. And we are so pleased that through their connections with all of you, that we can present the information that we will today. So in the next few years, 2 years actually, we will be seeing significant changes to the FAFSA process. And this will simplify and provide greater clarity for students and families. But what that also means is that we all are going to need to update our knowledge base and our vocabulary for how we speak to students and their families. So next year, we do plan to offer financial aid workshops for the Florida high school counselors at 5 regional locations across the state. So please be on the lookout for those announcements and make plans to attend one of those events next fall. Finally, thank you so much for the work you do to support high school seniors in their pursuit of higher education. We know that without your guidance and your persistence, we know that many of the capable students may not realize their dream of education beyond high school. So thank you for being here today. And we look forward to greeting you, hopefully, next year in person. And with that, I want to turn it over to our esteemed presenters, Daniel Barkowitz and Karina Mantell.
Thank you so much, President Conrad. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, Karina.
Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great. Good. I'm looking forward to this actually. So, so we're going to have fun together in the next 17 hours. We're going to teach you everything you need to know about financial aid. Just kidding. Karina and I are going to share a presentation with you, really focused on the information you need to know to be ready to talk about financial aid with your students. But we have a couple of poll questions we would like to start with. So Kathy, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, we're curious to hear from you. How many years of experience in school counseling do you have? So let's get some votes in. Are you a relative newbie? Have you been doing this for a while? Where are you in your time frame?
Daniel, lots of active voting going on, so we're just
Awesome.
gonna wait until that starts to slow down. Lots of votes coming in.
Who's leading the pack at this point?
6+. So we have an experienced group here.
That's great.
So looks like votes are slowing down. So if you haven't voted yet, get it in now. I'm going to probably shut that down in about 5 seconds.
And we do have one more question for you as well. So that's great to know. I'm curious. Okay, great. So about a quarter of the audience has 1 to 2 years. So relatively new folks in the field, and about a little over half, almost 60%, 6+. So Karina, we have our work cut out for us because we've got both newbies and more experienced folks, but we will make sure to cover through both areas for you. Great.
Do you want to go through the other poll now, or you want
the other one as well? Yes.
Okay. Well, let's do it. So here we're looking to see your familiarity with FAFSA completion. Are you a newbie, somewhat familiar, moderately familiar, or very familiar? Lots of votes going on.
So very familiar. If very familiar, why aren't you leading the presentation? That's the question, right? Yes.
Next year.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So where are you on this range of options?
Okay, let's give it 2 more seconds. It looks like the vote is slowing down here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that out. This one's a little more balanced.
Great. Okay, good. So we have folks all over the chart. So here's what we're going to do. And thank you, Kathy, for running those. That'll help us as we prepare to help you. So Karina and I are going to spend some time with you this morning, and we'll make sure to balance our comments. For those of you who are more experienced, we'll give you some deep dives, but also for those of you who are relatively new, we'll cover the basic ground as well. And that's about what we expected as we put our presentation together. But to start, let's introduce ourselves, Karina, because I don't know that folks necessarily know who we are. So I'm going to share my slideshow, and then Karina, let's dive in. And why don't you begin? Who are you, Karina?
Sure. My name is Dr. Karina Campbell Mantell. I'm one of the associate directors in the Office of Student Financial Assistance at the University of Central Florida, and I am most passionate about outreach. So this is the part of my job I love the most.
And how long have you been working in financial aid, Karina?
I started when I was 2, so I've been doing this for 18 years.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay. And it is my pleasure to be with Karina today. We are neighbors in the Central Florida area. I am Assistant Vice President of Financial Aid and Veterans Affairs at Valencia College, just down the road. And I've been at Valencia for about 4 years, a little over 4 years, although I've been working in the industry for over 30 years. Like Karina, I also started when I was 2. So we think we've got some great stuff to share with you today. We're going to go ahead and dive in. And so I'm going to handle the first half of the presentation, and then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Mantell for her to finish up for us. As you heard from Kathy when we started, there is a Q&A box. So if you have any question as we go, please feel free to type your question in that Q&A box, and we will address it either as we go through the slides or at the end. We'll leave plenty of time for questions as well. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to cover 4 topics. What is financial aid? Where does the financial aid come from? When and how do students apply for financial aid? And how do we deal with unique circumstances, especially in the era of COVID and massive unemployment and students who are becoming more and more non-traditional, what is the response? How do we handle those unique circumstances? So let's dive in. So let's start with an overview. So I like this chart because I find it helpful to sort of give a sense of the marketplace. There is some good news in terms of money that's available. In 2019-20, according to the College Board, who publishes an annual Trends in Student Aid, there was over 196 billion given out in undergraduate financial aid in that 2019-20 year. So that's the great news, a lot of money. What's the sort of challenging news? The challenging news is that a lot of it is in the form of loans, but the loan percentage has actually been reducing over time, not increasing, which again is good news. So loans, although you don't hear that in the news, loans have actually been reducing over time. And actually, here's how this breaks out. From a type of funding perspective, about 32% of the funding that's available for students, about a third, is in the form of loans. Of the remainder, 62% is in the form of grants or scholarships. And tax benefits, we often don't think of tax benefits as a financial aid source, but there are tax benefits as well that families can claim on their income tax when they pay tuition expenses. And that's about 6% of the money that's available nationwide. The other good news is where the money's coming from. Only about half of it's coming from the federal government, again, nationwide. About 28% is coming from private institutions, or from private and public institutions, from institutional sources, I should say. And actually, if you look at the pie chart, what you'll see is the single largest slice of pie is the institutional grant portion. That's over $55 billion. That is money that institutions, both public and private, are reinvesting in their students to help them succeed and to help them be successful. So we want to make sure that we are clear to students and families that they need to do what they need to do to apply for institutional grants, because in fact, they're more likely to get an institutional grant than they are nationwide a federal grant. Federal grants are only about 28 billion, about half of the institutional grant portion. Private grants, right? Private grants are only about 14%, and state grants only about 6%. And I apologize. It looks like this is that slice of the private grant. I'm not sure why it doesn't have a label, but it's there. So again, the question is, families really need to focus on making sure they do what they need to do to qualify for that institutional grant portion. The other thing I'll point out, you'll see, and we'll get you a copy of these slides, we'll post them on the page as well. You'll see this link to something called Moneyman Blog. This is a blog that I maintain on financial aid, and you're welcome. You'll see some links throughout the presentation. If you go to Moneyman Blog, there's details far beyond the time we'll have today that will give you more information about the topics we're covering. So again, if you have a chance, take a look. You'll learn a lot of good information from the blog. And finally, and you know this, although it can feel overwhelming for families, this is a manageable process. And thanks, and I echo President Conrad's comments. It's really thanks to you and your excellent work that inspires and makes possible our students' dreams. We work in partnership with you to make this process manageable. We don't want this to feel overwhelming. So we thank you in advance, and thank you again for being with us today to do this deep dive. So the next question is, with the expense of college, is it worth it? What we know is that colleges can be pretty expensive. And in fact, you'll see this in a slide upcoming, but a year at our most expensive colleges these days in the country run close to $80,000 a year. So over the course of 4 years, a family might be expending, if they pay all of that, about $320,000 to send their kid to college. Is it worth it? Is it worth that expense these days? And I think, we can still say it is, but how do we know? So one of the charts that we use often to help educate families, this is one. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows you in 2020, which, what do we know about 2020? It was a unique year for lots of reasons. You can see on the right side of this chart in the green, the unemployment rate as reported by sector. And what we know about this past year is that the families and students who were most likely to be impacted by the pandemic and by the massive unemployment we experienced were those with a high school diploma or less as their highest level of degree attainment. You can see that just by getting an associate's degree, right, you've reduced the chances of being unemployed nationwide, and specifically a bachelor's degree as well. And so it's, really the benefit to the family is lifelong. You can also see the earnings. So this is average earnings based again on that educational level. And you can see that the associate's degree moves you significantly. Actually, in Central Florida, and I know FCAN does a terrific job of releasing these statistics county by county, but across Florida, the associate's degree actually has even a more significant impact in terms of raising a family's income. So associate's degree and bachelor's degree will help lifelong in terms of income adjustment for the family. And this chart really makes the point, in case you haven't seen this. This again comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what you'll see here is how the unemployment rate has changed month by month over the last 20 years. And that red line is less than a high school diploma. The light blue line is high school graduates without college. The darker blue line is some college or associate's degree, and the green line is the bachelor's degree. So what do we know? What we know is that in times of severe crisis, and the shaded areas are times of recession, again, the impact is largest felt among our populations with the least amount of education. And the recovery has been tremendous and fast for those with higher levels of education. So as you speak with families, we give you this information as perhaps a way to make this even more relevant or clear for families as we go. Okay, so let's move on. So what's some simple vocabulary you need to know? So really there are three pieces of information that we take into account. And as you heard President Conrad say, some of these names are changing. So we've all gotten used to saying EFC and explaining EFC. Starting in the year 24-25, that's no longer going to be a word that we use. And stay tuned, we'll talk about the Student Aid Index, but it's several years down the road. But for now, we use these terms: cost of attendance, an expected family contribution, and financial need. And I want to define what those are for you. So again, cost of attendance is a combination of direct and indirect costs. So tuition and fees directly billed to the family, potentially room and board. If a student is going to UCF, maybe they're living in a dorm. If they're coming to Valencia, probably not. And so in that situation, we give them an allowance for room and board, but room and board is in there, meals as board, books, supplies, transportation, other expenses. So in combination, all of those expenses form a cost of attendance. And we calculate an average cost of attendance for students that we use in the determination of the ability to pay and their aid that they receive. The family contribution is what comes out of the FAFSA application. That is the estimate of what a family can afford toward those costs. And the difference is the need. So as we talk about cost of attendance, let's look at some sample costs. So Karina, I've picked up on UCF. You and me sit on the left corner here, and you can see all the way up to the right side where we have Harvard. So a couple of things. What do you notice about this chart? So let's pick up a couple of things here. First of all, if you look at the right, the highest expense in the country is somewhere in the range of about $80,000 a year. Are students really paying $80,000 to go to Harvard? Some are, most aren't. Right. The reality is that most families can't afford that. So some amount of that cost is covered by financial aid. But as you start moving to the left of the chart, you'll start to see things separate out. And I know my good friend Kevin McCrary is out on the call somewhere. Kevin is at Bethune-Cookman. You can see in the Bethune-Cookman example here, there are two sections. Why is Bethune-Cookman's cost separated in two different sections? Well, the reality is for Bethune-Cookman, they have two budgets. They have a budget that is for people living on campus, and they have a budget for people living off campus. So that budget is different depending upon whether you're living with relatives or your parents off campus, or whether you're living independently and need to provide your own support. So that's the difference in those two budgets for Bethune-Cookman. You can see for the colleges then FAMU and moving to the left, there are 4 categories. There's on-campus or off-campus, and there's in-state or out-of-state. So if I pick, for example, let's pick my friends at University of Florida. If I pick UF, you'll see that the benefit of being an in-state resident is pretty sizable. So if I look at the difference between the light blue and the purple number, it's about $22,000. I'm saving $22,000 just by being an in-state resident if I go to the University of Florida. My costs are subsidized because I'm an in-state resident qualifying for residency. Residency, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about today, but that's a separate process from financial aid. Residency is often handled by the admissions or registrar's office. Really important that a student establish residency, especially if they've been or they're going to a public institution, because that residency can be a significant advantage in terms of cost savings. And I know, there are lots of rules around residency. One of the ones I just want to highlight is that students who are undocumented or Daca, who graduate from a public high school in Florida, can qualify for in-state tuition rates with documentation of their number of years at the high school. So again, residency is an area that maybe we'll take some questions on, but really best addressed by talking to the individual college's admissions or registrar's office. So we talked about that formula. How does it work for one student? So let's say I'm applying to 5 different colleges, and the colleges range in cost from $70,000 down to $10,000 a year. And what I've determined is my family contribution is about $10,000. That family contribution should be roughly the same regardless of what college I'm applying to. The idea here is you go through the system, you fill out your information, you get back a family contribution. That is your family contribution. What changes is college by college how much financial aid you might qualify for. That's that yellow section of the slide referring to need. So ideally, a family should pay the same cost, again, based on their EFC, regardless of which institution they're attending as their EFC. That's really how the formula works. So let's see, a couple of, let's see, my slide seems to be having, there we go. So the one thing I just want to remind you is that price is not cost, right? So a lot of students will react negatively to a sticker price. They'll see a cost of $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000, and they'll turn tail and say, I can't afford that. But as you work with families, really price or sticker price is what we call the cost of attendance, but it's the net price. It's what the true cost is once we subtract your grants and scholarships that's going to be most important for families to know. And for families who need to know that, how do they figure it out? How do they come up quickly with a net price, right? Rather than going through the whole application process, doing the Fafsa, is there a faster way to at least get an estimate of what I might have to pay? Well, there is, and it's called the net price calculator. So every college in the country is required to have this on their website. And it's usually on their admissions or financial aid page. But with some simple questions, you can get an estimate of what the family contribution is and what kind of financial aid award you might be expecting to receive at that institution. So I've given you a link. There's a national link of every net price calculator in the country at this website, collegecost.ed.gov/net price. My only caveat is, remember that if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage back. So the estimate's only as good as the information entered by the family. But this is a great way for families to at least get an initial estimate of what kind of financial aid they might qualify for using that net price calculator. So some other vocabulary. What is financial aid made up of? There are 3 different kinds of funds, and probably most of us focus on the first one, which is grants and scholarships, right? That's money we don't have to repay. That's great for the family. That's terrific. Generally, grants, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but a general rule. Generally, grants refer to something that's need-based, so you qualify because you have financial need, and generally scholarships have an academic component, but we'll talk a little more about that in a second. Loans, what about loans? Loans aren't a bad thing. I know that there's been a lot of negative press about student loans, about borrowing for college. The reality is most students will have to borrow some amount to help support themselves in their educational journey. The question is, how much is too much? And so one of the things we want to help in counseling families and students is to avoid borrowing more than they'll be able to repay. Now, there are lots of repayment plans on federal loans, which will allow students to base their repayment on what they earn and do other things that will help them when it comes time to repayment. But a general rule of thumb that I like to recommend to families is that the student think about borrowing no more in total student loans and total other loans by the time they graduate than they would be earning as their starting salary. So I'm going to make up some numbers and just play with me for a second here. Let's say a student decides, you know what, I'm gonna go through college, and my goal in life is to be an early childhood educator. I want to work in a preschool setting with young kids. And they do the research and figure out that on average, the starting salary for folks, and I'm going to make this number up, but the starting salary for folks graduating and beginning as an early childhood educator is about $21,000 a year. If that's the case, then that student should borrow no more in total loans by the time they graduate than $21,000, because they might feel challenged to make repayment if they've borrowed more. That includes not just their student loans, but a car loan, credit card debt, everything, right? On the other hand, let's say you've got a student who says, well, I'm going to be an engineer when I graduate, and I'm going to be doing environmental engineering, and on average at graduation, folks who leave earn about $50,000 a year. Well, that student, can they borrow up to $50,000? Should they? Well, they can, but should they, right? So again, you want to keep loans low, but it gives you a little more room to be affordable with that borrowing. So important for students to have a sense of what their outcome is, so they know sort of what's a reasonable debt level to take on. And you can do research. Most colleges have information about starting salaries that might help as people understand what their investment requirement might be. The other thing, I'll just say one more thing about loans before I turn to work. Lots of families, are maybe resistant to borrow to help pay for education. What I will say is the benefit of education is lifelong. We showed that before. To sort of have an expectation you're going to pay all of the cost of that if a family has an EFC that's maybe feels a little out of their range, to expect that you're going to pay all of that in the year that you get the education may not be a realistic expectation. We don't want families paying loans forever. No one does. I'm still paying my loans from graduate school personally, and for my kids' school as well. But it's reasonable to expect that there may be some borrowing required that carries you forward. And I know Karina will spend a little more time talking about loans and plans for payment for a family's family contribution. So what's the third type of financial aid? The third type is work. And many colleges have what they call a work-study program. This is a terrific opportunity for a student to get a job either on or off campus and get paid to work on or off campus developing skills. One of the things I'll say about work study that a lot of students don't know, let's say you work with a student who has terrific passion for community service. They love volunteering. They love going out in the community and working for Habitat for Humanity, or they have a particular project that they're fascinated by and really passionate about. Colleges are required to spend a portion of their work awards paying students to do community service. So if a student has a real passion for community service, they should check in with the employment office at the college to see what kind of community service opportunities are available. And it may be the case that they can do the same kind of work they're passionate about in high school, in college, and get paid, in a sense, to volunteer. So that's another sort of little known secret. We're required, although in this pandemic era, it's been waived, but we're required to spend 7% of the funds we receive to fund work study in community service. So it's a great opportunity there as well. So let's talk about the forms that you need to know. Before we launch in here, let's see. Any questions, Kathy, that you see that we should handle? Anything that's come up that we want to address?
So far, so good, Daniel.
Okay, great. So Kathy, while you're here, I'm going to pick on you for a second. You
Please.
can leave your video on. But this is the interactive portion. If we were live in person, I'd ask for a volunteer, but in this case, I'm volunteering you. So Kathy, we're gonna make the argument that you have a child who's entering the college application cycle. Does this child have a name?
We'll use my son, Liam. He'll be our.
Okay, Liam is going to be your son. Name some colleges that Liam is thinking about applying to for financial aid.
University of Florida.
Yes.
And Northwestern.
Yes.
And FSU.
And let's throw in UCF, of course.
Great.
And Valencia.
Great.
Okay, so we have 5 colleges, Northwestern's in there as well. How many applications, and this is a question for the audience, you don't have to type it in, but just curious, how many applications for financial aid does Kathy and her family, or will Kathy and her family have to complete? Is it 1? Is it 5? Is it 27? So I'm seeing people are typing in the Q&A, which we can dismiss, but that's great. So I'm seeing 1. All of you are wrong, so I appreciate your attempt at the answer, but what is the wrong answer? This is exactly why we do this. Yep. So Kathy, do you know how many applications do you think Liam and you are going to have to do?
I know you're going to stump me. I know obviously FAFSA and the Florida financial aid application. And then many times the institutions themselves may have one.
Stop. You're doing my presentation. I only asked you for the number, not the types.
Well, that's how I think through it. So we said 5 institutions.
Yep.
I'm going to guess 7.
Okay. And Karina, do you want to weigh in as well?
I would venture to say that in this particular case, the family would have to do the CSS profile, the FAFSA application, and the Florida financial aid application.
And I also add in an institutional application. So let's talk about those. So my answer for Kathy would be 8. And I'm going to talk about the 8 of them as we go through. So the other piece, and Kathy, I'll let you answer this question as you go. And your primer is in the top right of the slide. The answer is always October 1st. So just in case I ask you a question about a date, the date you want to answer is October 1st. Okay, so what's the first application? All of you who answered 1 probably are thinking FAFSA. Perfect, you're right. Right, the FAFSA is required by every college. So Kathy's going to do 1 FAFSA for Liam. She's going to list 5 colleges on that FAFSA. It is a free form. The first word is free. It is a free form. You never want to pay someone to do a FAFSA. You can find it online, or you can find it on your cell phone. So there's now what's called the My Student Aid app, where you can download and do the FAFSA right on your cell phone. Kathy, when does the FAFSA go live?
It goes live on October 1st.
That's right. So hence the reason we're doing this session today. FAFSA goes live October 1, and it goes live October 1 of the student's senior year in high school for the following year. So starting on October 1, families can complete the FAFSA. Do you want to do it on October 1? Well, you want to do it as soon as possible. Any guesses as to why that might be, Kathy? Why grab a sip of coffee?
Because some forms of aid are first come, first serve.
That's right. That's right. And so you want to make sure to get your application in, or the students get their application in as soon as possible. When is it too late to do a FAFSA? The FAFSA closes on June 30th of the actual attendance year. So we're starting right now the application cycle for 22-23. So October 1, 2021 is when the FAFSA goes live. Families can complete that FAFSA all the way up to June 30th of 2023. I wouldn't suggest waiting that long, obviously, but you can do it that late if a student makes a last-minute enrollment choice or a last-minute choice. Even families who don't think they're going to qualify should get the FAFSA done, because at least it's on record and in. And so it's easy to do. If Kathy had 2 kids going to college, let's say Liam and pick another name.
Sam is my daughter's name. Sam.
Okay. So if she had 2 going to college, she'd have to do 2 FAFSAs. The good news is that you can actually, as a parent, transfer information from one FAFSA to another. So it becomes easier to do the second one. But again, you do have to do one FAFSA per child per year, and it is an annual form. Number two, so we talked about the CSS profile. Karina mentioned the profile. Only some colleges need this form, and this is a paid form. It costs, I believe the costs are about $25 to register, and somewhere in the range of $18 to $20 per college. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's about right. There are waivers, fee waivers available for families who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, free lunch through your school. But some colleges need this. Why would a college need the CSS profile, and who's going to need it? Well, the chances are, if you're going to a high-cost private institution, or your student is, they're going to need the CSS profile. And what college on your list was a high-cost private institution?
Northwestern.
That's right. So Northwestern is going to need this form. Kathy, when does this form go live?
I'm going to guess October 1st.
That is a good guess. So October 1st is when it goes live again. So why would we need this? Remember, when I started out, I said about 28% of the funding available nationwide is from private and public institutions. Families who skip this, if the college requires it, who skip this form, will not qualify for that private institution funding. And so really important that they do this application. There's some questions on here that aren't on the FAFSA. They get into a little more detail, and it's really information they need for their awarding. So really important that your students who are looking at high-cost institutions, private institutions, look at this. Also, if you happen to advise international students, unlikely, but if you happen to advise international students, there's an international financial aid profile that's part of this as well for students who are coming to the US from abroad. If you're unclear if the college needs it or not, if you go to this website, you'll be able to see all the colleges that request the profile and for what populations they request it. So I've got one FAFSA, one profile. Now let's talk about institutional applications. So this is a possible, not every school will have one, but some schools will require a separate application for their scholarships or funding. Let me talk about Valencia, because I forced Liam to apply to Valencia. So let's make sure that we address what's going on at Valencia. At Valencia, we have a private foundation which raises money to support students through scholarship giving, and they have a scholarship application. If you do not complete the scholarship application, we don't award you a scholarship. So again, private funds, private rules, you need to follow the rules of the college. So as a counselor, I would advise students check the websites of each of their colleges of interest and find out if there's a separate application form for their funding, for their application. Karina, at UCF, is there a separate application form, or is it just part of the admissions process separately?
So that is a twofold question. So when it comes to our merit-based admission scholarships, it's a part of the admission process. All students are considered based on their academic rigor coming in from high school and the competitiveness of the class, the incoming class. However, we do have what we call access to opportunities, which is our online scholarship search tool that allows students to apply for institutional scholarships. There is a one-page application for many of our scholarships that go through our scholarship committee, and that also houses our scholarship listing of all of the external scholarships we want our students to be aware of.
Great. So again, this is not a requirement, but a student who doesn't do the application isn't going to qualify. So really important that families plan for this. Kathy, when do you think the applications go live?
October 1st.
This is a trick question because it depends on the college, but yeah, probably somewhere around October 1, but each college makes up its own rules. So, I would say students should check in and find out sort of where we're at. So it's potentially, Liam could do 5 institutional applications, 1 FAFSA, 1 profile. So we're up to 7. I did say 8, and you mentioned 1 other, and I'm thrilled actually that we have on the phone with us, or on the line with us, the expert on this. But before we get here, here's what that homepage looks like on the FAFSA. So when you log in, that's what you're going to see when you log in. And we can talk a little more about FAFSA in question and answer if you have some. But what about Florida? And I'm going to invite my good friend Pete Hernandez to unmute and say hello. Pete's on the call as well. So Pete, let's talk about the Florida application. Do you want to say a word about what we should know about Florida?
And good morning all and welcome. Yes, in regards to the Florida financial aid application, it also has an opening date of October 1st.
Wait, I was going to quiz Kathy on that one, but you beat me to the punch, Pete. So sorry, just teasing.
Not a problem. We encourage, at the Florida Department of Education, we encourage all high school seniors, no matter what their status is, to complete the Florida financial aid application. The Florida financial aid application is for all high school seniors to be specifically meeting the criteria for the Florida Bright Futures Scholarship. It is a requirement. However, for all other students, we do have additional state grants and scholarships that require the Florida financial aid application. But we at the Florida Department of Education want to say, by filling out both the FAFSA and the Florida financial aid applications, you are considered for federal funds, state funds, and institutional funds. So that is my 2-minute commercial. But once again, we encourage all high school seniors to complete the Florida financial aid application.
Thank you for that, Pete. And I would suggest Florida has a phenomenal website with lots of good information about the Florida application, about the aid programs that are available. It's at floridastudentfinancialaid.org. For most of you, again, you'll know this, but your high school generally will have students complete this application maybe in an English class senior year, or their social studies class English senior year. So generally, you'll do this within the school day, and it's a fairly simple application. But as Pete said, we really want every student in Florida to do this, because what we know is, even if I'm a student that says, I'm going to go out of state, I'm not staying in Florida, you can't go back and redo this later. You have to do it during that senior year in high school, and students' plans change. So we want to make sure that you get that application in. The other common mistake is people think, if I'm not going to qualify for Bright Futures, why should I bother? And as Pete said, there are, and I highlight here, there are 14 different state scholarship grant and work programs that Florida offers. Bright Futures is only one of them. So we want to make sure that you get that application in for your students, that they apply, so that they make sure that they're in the cycle and in the process. So how do you sign, and thank you to all of you for playing a little bit with that. How do you sign the application? If we're doing this electronically, there's no paper. What does the application look like? What is the signature? And the signature is something called an FSA ID. So your FSA ID, just like your credit card password or login or your bank login, it's a combination of a username and a password. And you need to have one for the student and a different one for the parent. At least one parent needs to have that FSA ID. You have to use 2 different email addresses, and you can set it up at fsaid.ed.gov. That's part of the application process, but once the student has that FSA ID, they'll use it every year going forward. So they want to make sure they keep a record of that. Same for a parent. So it becomes your permanent way of signing every federal financial aid information piece. That includes your application for loans, for federal student loans, your renewal of your FAFSA the next year, et cetera. So if you go to the FSA ID page, you'll see this is what the login looks like. And if you need to create one, you'll see under create an account, the ability to start and create an FSA ID. For many families, this is actually the most complicated piece, because you need to have your social security number, your date of birth, your official name as written on your social security card. So if for our Hispanic populations, you want to make sure to include the full name, if that's what's on your social security card, because there is a match that's performed. And you want to make sure the student knows and writes in the correct social security number, because it is matched on that social security number as well. This is my one joke. Well, I hope it's a joke. I hope you laugh, but here's the joke. It's not a parent. Who's a parent? Karina, did you chuckle at least a little bit?
When I first saw the slide, I chuckled a bit.
Okay, thank you very much. So
That helps.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's hard when we're doing this virtually with very little feedback. So what do I mean by this? It's not clear maybe who is the custodial household, who's filling out the forms. If we're in a divorce situation, who's responsible for filling out that application? For the FAFSA, it's who the child lives with. So it's what we consider the custodial household. So if student lives with mom and stepdad, then mom and stepdad are those who fill out the FAFSA. If student lives with dad, then dad is who fills out the FAFSA. Well, what if student lives evenly, literally every week I'm going back and forth as a student between the two households? Who then has to fill out the form? At that point, the question becomes who provides more financial support. So only then do we look at who gives more money, and that becomes the person who fills out the form. For institutional funds and for profile application, some colleges, mostly private, may ask for information from the other parent as well. So in Liam's case, if Liam's parents were divorced, they're not, but if they were, then Liam's father might have to do application material separately from Liam's mother for the purposes of Northwestern. But most colleges don't want information about non-custodial family or non-custodial parent. Now, this is one of those things that is changing in 24-25. So not to confuse you, but this is the rule for right now. Things will look a little different in a couple of years from now. So just be aware, and we'll give you lots of advance notice as things are changing. The other question that often happens, and especially I see this with a lot of our students, is, am I dependent or independent? Do I have to provide parental information? And I saw there was a question about what if my parents refuse to provide information? So we're going to talk about all of that now, right? So first of all, the first question is, do I qualify as an independent student? If the student can answer yes to any of these questions, then they're automatically independent and no parental information is required. So those questions are pretty clear, right? Are you 24 or older? Are you a graduate student? Are you married or separated? This is the student, married or separated. Do you have kids of your own? Other dependents you support? Orphan, ward of the court, legal guardianship, unaccompanied youth at homeless or at risk of homelessness, active duty, or a veteran. If they can answer yes to any of these questions, they're an independent student. Otherwise, if they answer no to all of them, they're what's considered a dependent student. But what happens if that doesn't work? And we'll talk a little bit more. Karina will address this as she talks about special circumstances. But students who are in a unique circumstance can apply for what's called an independent override or a dependency override. They would start by filling out their FAFSA without any parent information, and they would call the college that they're interested in and say, what do you need for me to show you that I don't have a relationship with my parents any longer? What documentation can I provide? There is a process for that, and especially because we realize that, like any application, the FAFSA is going to fit a majority of circumstances, but there's a sizable number of families it won't work for. So if you have a student who's in that sort of situation, you want to be in contact with the college to explore what needs to happen here. And there are lots of what ifs, and we can get into the what ifs. So what if, for example, students living with their grandparents? Do their grandparents fill out the form? No. Grandparents would never fill out the form unless they adopted the student. So, there are all kinds of what ifs we can get into with more, and I'm sure some of those questions are probably already coming into the Q&A, which is absolutely fine. And so, we can address that as well. I also see there's a question about if the parent claimed the child on their taxes, isn't that the one who has to fill out the FAFSA? That's not true. Again, it's based on where the family lives, where the student lives, not necessarily who's filling out or who's claiming the student for tax purposes.
Also, Danielle, there's a question about a student being a senior in high school but married. Is that student considered dependent for the purpose of the FAFSA? And that student would be independent for the purpose of the FAFSA. Their marital status deems them so, regardless.
Thank you for that. Yeah, keep in mind, though, a private college may still want parent information for their funds. But for federal funds, yes, that student is absolutely independent if she's married. And this happened to me. I got married when I was a sophomore in college. And so we were independent federally, but dependent for institutional purposes. So great question. Okay, so what year's information are we using? And I'm getting close to the end of my slides and we're going to turn this over to Karina. But for just to give you an orientation, I mean, we're starting October 1. So what financial information do I have? So basically, for students attending for 22-23, the FAFSA goes live October 1st. So the information we're going to use is the last completed tax year. And that last completed tax year is 2020 information. So we're going to be using the income that you earned or the family earned in 2020 when we file the FAFSA. Now, we know, of course, that there's a lot of differences that might be possible. So I've given you a sort of a arrow to lay this out for you. So your income information is going to be based on 2020, but a family's asset information and who's in the family is going to be based on what's true as of that date you're filing the FAFSA. So you can see in the chart, you earned the income from January to December of 2020. You filed your tax return, from January to July of 2020, depending upon the extensions or what you might have out there. You're starting that FAFSA now, and the school year starts in August. So for many families, that's, already now almost a year, or at least, 8 months from when that income was actually earned, and you're starting to have to pay the bill, that late forward. Actually, this should say August of 2022. I'm sorry, I missed that on that chart, right? The school year starts actually August of 2022. So it's a year plus away. So what happens? What if the income's dramatically different? Let's say a family's lost a job, or let's say there's been some other loss in the family. That's a situation where you would have a special circumstance. And Karina will address that a little later in the presentation. And I've got a blog entry here as well that talks significantly about that circumstance. How does your information get to the FAFSA? We use something called the IRS data retrieval, where the system actually automatically links up with the IRS. And that's great. If you're a family, you want to be able to use that because it makes it easier for you on the application. You don't have to enter in your individual numbers. It does carry over masked, so families won't be able to confirm the number because of privacy reasons, but it will bring over information automatically and make it easier for the family to apply. Families can enter by hand, but you're more likely to be selected for what we call verification if you indeed enter your information by hand. So what is verification? About 35% of the applicants nationwide are selected for what's called verification. Verification is a process the federal government requires where you have to prove that what you submitted on the FAFSA is legitimate. And colleges are required to collect information from you, from the family, which might include copies of the tax forms. That's why we suggest using the data retrieval tool, a verification form, perhaps proof of identity or proof of high school graduation or proof of immigration status. So it's important that families, if they can, use that data retrieval tool to minimize the chance. And this process can be very clunky for families. I know for this year, for the 21-22 year, the year we're in right now, as of July 13th, the government waived verification requirements for the rest of the academic year, but at least in terms of income verification. But for right now, what we know about the 22-23 year is verification is back on. So we will still be expected to verify, at least for now, verify families who apply if they're selected for 22-23. Okay. I think my last topic before I turn this over to Karina, how do we decide who gets what money, especially that big slice of institutional funds? There are 3 different kinds of awards for grants and scholarships. They're what I would call merit-based financial aid. That's talent-based financial aid. So at UCF, as we heard, that may be something like a presidential award. At Valencia, we have awards that are specifically on talent base. In Florida, the Bright Futures is specifically talent based. There's no need component for that application. Right? Did you want to say something in addition, Karina?
Nope, just wanted to be ready if you asked the question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I keep on putting you on the spot. I appreciate it. But the majority of funding that's out there is in the form of need. Right, so need is most of the funding that's available nationwide All federal money, most state money, and most college money is awarded using that system. But there is a unique category called merit within need. And what I mean by that is that in some situations, private colleges and some new federal programs allow for merit to be considered as part of the awarding. So the more talented a student is, the more money they might get within their need category. So important that as you help advise students, we often talk about picking an admission safety. I'm sure that's probably something all of you have heard of, a school where I'm guaranteed to get in as a student. My advice to counselors is to help students think about a financial safety. Where am I, it may be the same school, but where am I a kind of student that the college would desire to come? Because it's possible the college may put some money on the table to help encourage that student to make a determination to attend that institution. Okay, so we're going to do one last thing, and then I'm going to turn this over. But before we do, I see our trusty host, Kathy, has joined us. Are there some questions we can answer?
Well, I wanted to pose one to you live just because it is one we hear often. Is it a good idea for juniors to apply for the FAFSA and scholarships early? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, so I would not suggest doing the FAFSA because there's no value to doing the FAFSA. However, for a junior, if you're counseling juniors, there's lots of things they can be doing. One is they can take a look at those net price calculators, see, do their research and see sort of what might be expected from them when it comes time to apply for financial aid. Also, Karina is going to cover private scholarships, and there's lots of private scholarships where you can start your application cycle now, or at least start working on your essays and things that might help you stand out. Anything you want to add to that, Karina, as well?
I would just say the scholarship search process can begin as early as middle school. A lot of schools are securing dollars for their higher education costs well before they get to college. So I just think that the scholarship search, it's never too early to begin that process. And there are some students who are able to secure funds well before reaching a college or university.
Great. And the other one I'll pose to you, and Karina, you may be getting to this, but the other one we get asked about a lot is how to help students who are undocumented.
That is a great question. And I do have a little bit that I'll cover there. For our undocumented students, the fact is that they do not qualify for federally funded financial aid, but there are scholarships available for undocumented students. And one that comes to mind is the Dream.us scholarship is a scholarship foundation dedicated to helping undocumented students cover their educational expenses. I will be very candid that often it's not as robust of a financial aid package for our undocumented students as it is for students who are documented, but there are resources that are available to help them navigate the costs associated with going to college.
Great, thanks for that. I appreciate that because that is one we get quite regularly. Okay, back to your...
Don't disappear because we're going to do this together. So I need some people to show this. So we're going to do a quick little fun activity. So all of you all get ready, and we're going to do it this way. So what I'd like to do is have everyone fold their arms. So fold your arms. Now, all of you who are participating, fold your arms. Look down and see which wrist is in front or which wrist is showing. So presumably one of them is in front. So let's start with left. If your wrist that's showing is your left wrist, let's do it this way. For those of you who are on the call and participating, if you have a left wrist showing, why don't you lift up your hand? There's a hand raise function. See if you can lift up your hand, and let's see how many folks we have that they have the left wrist showing. Look at that. So good to know you all are playing along with us. I'm seeing about 62 of you, 63 of you who have your left wrist showing. Great. You all are what are called visual learners. So you process information by seeing it. So what does that mean? So it's great that we have the slide. If I did something like this, it would drive you crazy. Let's see if I can even do it. I was going to try to blank my screen, but you prefer to see the information. It drives you crazy. You don't have the PowerPoint slides for you to actually have for your own right now. We will get them to you, I promise. But yes, you're a person who likes to see information. Chances are you're taking notes because note-taking helps you actually learn that information as well. So if everyone can lower their hand, who raised it before, let's get all the hands lowered. Thank you very much. How many of you is it your right wrist which is showing? And if you're playing along, by the way, that should be the rest of you. I'm just saying. Okay, so you all are what are called oral learners, or you learn information by hearing it. So my cuts every word, it would drive you crazy. What I said is if my audio cut out every other word, it would drive you crazy, right? You like to hear the information. Music can be all encompassing for you. It's a passion, and it can be distracting. So you're what's called an oral learner. Okay, let's lower those hands if you can. Put your hands down. For how many of you did that not work? Be brave. That really didn't describe you. You're what's called a kinesthetic learner. You learn it by doing it. Your best approach is to jump in and actually get the job done. So we have a position available as a financial aid officer in my office, and I'll be taking resumes before that. I'm just teasing, but yeah, you prefer to jump in and actually get the work done. That's your preferred modality. And the reason we did this, all of you can lower your hands. As I turn this over to Karina, who's done already a bang up job, but I'm sure we'll do an even better job once I stop talking. We're gonna give you a picture for those of you that are visual learners to sort of sum up everything I've described so far. Karina is going to describe it for those of you that are oral learners. And for the kinesthetic learners, good luck. You'll just have to, dive in. But let's talk about it. All of you can lower your hands if you don't mind. Let's talk about, Karina, what is the financial aid barrel? And can you describe for us the financial aid barrel?
So the financial aid barrel is a visual to help students and families understand how they can actually meet their cost of attendance. So we talked about the cost of attendance being that budget created by the college or university that the student is going to attend. In this particular case, the cost of attendance has been set at $25,000. We then talked about the expected family contribution, or the EFC, which is measuring the family's financial strength based on the information provided on the FAFSA. And that EFC is the number that the federal government has come up with based on that information that the family can contribute to the student's educational expenses. So in this case, the EFC is $5,000. And Daniel, I thank you very much for using round numbers, because as much as people think I might love math, I do not. So that leaves us with $20,000 of unmet financial need for the student. And so after we are looking at the expected family contribution, again, where the family is going to contribute to the student's educational costs, how are we going to then meet the other need? So we're looking at gift aid. And in this case, the student is eligible for $7,000 in grants and $6,800 in scholarships, giving us $13,800 that the student is getting in gift aid, free money the student does not have to repay. So then the next part of tackling the student's educational expenses, after we look at that free money, and I always like to say free money is good money. We want our students to maximize their free money. We want them to get as much free money as possible. And in this case, the student has done a pretty good job of getting free money. To Daniel's point earlier, students don't have much influence on their grant eligibility. Grant eligibility is often going to be based on need, the information provided on the various applications the student is submitting. But scholarship dollars, that's where students have a lot more autonomy and dominion over what their scholarship package could look like. So after we get that gift aid and get as much free money as possible, then students need to look at what I refer to as self-help aid. Self-help aid comes in the form of loans, money that must be repaid, or work programs such as the federal work study program, money that must be earned. In this particular case, the student has $1,200 in the work study program and $3,500 in the direct loan program. So this student now has $4,700 of self-help aid to assist with their educational expenses. To the next part of the barrel, Daniel. So in total, the student has enough aid and their expected family contribution to leave us with a gap of $1,500 of the student's unmet need. So we do recognize, even though the student has just $1,500 in unmet need, the student also has that EFC of $5,000 that hasn't, that we don't have resources going towards. So in total, the student is looking to make up about $6,500 $100 in educational expenses for this particular institution. You can move on to the next slide. So how do they find the money for their expected family contribution? And I'm going to be candid because I'm a straight shooter. I know that for a lot of parents, when they see their expected family contribution, the number does not match what they can actually do financially. So for a lot of parents, when they see that number, they're trying to wrap their heads around, how will I support my student with their educational expenses? So they can look at past income, such as savings, and that is something that they report on the FAFSA, and it's considered as resources available to assist with the student's educational expenses. Of course, present income, such as salary, or learning if your institution has a payment plan and how you can go about utilizing that payment plan. And another way that families can look at paying the expected family contribution are loan programs, future income. So you're borrowing and you'll pay that later. Now I want to expand a little bit on the loan program. So we talked about the direct loan program for our students. The direct loan program is divided into two types of federal loans for students to borrow. There is the subsidized loan. The subsidized loan does have a need-based component, meaning students must have a positive number when we subtract the cost of attendance. When we subtract the expected family contribution from the cost of attendance and any other resources the student may be receiving. If that number is positive, then the student may be eligible for a subsidized loan. The subsidized loan, the government pays the interest while the student is enrolled, at least half time, and during periods of what we call deferment and grace. So times when the student is not in repayment for specific reasons, the government is going to pay the interest on behalf of the student. The unsubsidized loan, a student may receive regardless of their expected family contribution, regardless of their need, and a student does not have to have need to receive the unsubsidized federal loan. The unsubsidized loan does accrue interest once it is dispersed on the student's account. So there is a difference in the two loan programs. Students with need will qualify for a combination of subsidized and unsubsidized loans. Students who do not have need will qualify for the amount based on their academic classification in the unsubsidized loan program. In addition to the student loan programs, there is the Parent Plus loan available to assist parents to be the borrower on behalf of their students. So parents borrow, it is their debt, they are responsible for rendering payments. And when parents borrow the Parent Plus loan, they are able to borrow up to the student's cost of attendance minus any other resources the student is receiving. So this allows parents to really meet the student's educational expense needs. However, keep in mind, this is a loan, it must be repaid. So there's a balance with this, just like Daniel was mentioning, the balance. Our parent borrowers often have to figure out how much they can borrow and what's a reasonable amount for them to assume this new debt. So some insider tips. Find out deadlines and comply. And so I really like the recommendation to keep a matrix. A lot of this can get really confusing. There are a lot of different dates that are being offered by different institutions. Each institution has what they call a priority filing date for the FAFSA. And so I always tell students to file the FAFSA by the priority date of the institution, the first priority date of any institution that you're interested in attending. Because if you meet that one, then you'll meet the others as well. The priority dates vary by institution. It's really important to know that you've done your FAFSA, and filing by the priority date gives a student what we call in financial aid maximum consideration for financial aid. And what that maximum consideration does is it allows us to have an equitable way to divide limited resources and to allocate limited resources based on a deadline, for lack of a better word, established by that institution. Students should always keep copies of anything that they're sending, particularly as we mentioned, the verification process. Verification is going to entail students providing their financial aid office with additional documentation. If you're submitting a scholarship application or anything like that, I tell students to keep a file. Keep a financial aid file with all the information that you have submitted, any information you may need in the future, so that they're ready if there's anything that they need to supply at a later date. I encourage students to ask as many questions as they possibly can and lean on the resources that are available to them. Their guidance counselors, go to college nights at your high school. As I mentioned, outreach is my favorite part of my job. So, we do a lot of outreach in the community, in the schools, wanting students and families to understand a process that is often seen as daunting, a process that is often seen as intimidating, and we want to break down that barrier. The financial aid process is just that. It is a process, but it is a process that families can navigate. Don't rule out of school because of cost. There might be resources to help a student attend that school. Daniel mentioned Harvard and their lovely nearly $80,000 cost of attendance price tag. However, Harvard does have some programs specifically for specific income brackets that would mitigate many of those expenses associated with that cost of attendance. So a student should look at the schools that they're interested in attending and then find out what resources can assist them with the cost at that particular institution. However, given that bit of knowledge, I also tell students to really think about the cost associated with attending each institution. Daniel shared the net price calculator. Students really need to do their research because you are not comparing apples to apples when you're looking at school costs. You want to know the cost of the school, the resources available to you at that school, and what your bottom line is as a student in order to make an educated decision in regard to the cost of your educational expenses. And you want to explore all of your financing options, starting again with that free money. Free money is good money. It's applying for as many scholarships as possible, encouraging our students to do that, helping them on the process. I tell students, a lot of our students are amazing and they're doing so many great things. It's really easy to forget how wonderful they are for themselves because they have to sell themselves a bit when applying for scholarships. So I tell our students to keep a scholarship resume, simply a bulleted Word document that highlights all of the great things that make them a good candidate for scholarships, community service, awards, academic accolades, anything like that. They want to keep a running list of those things. So when it's time to share why they are going to be a good candidate for a specific award, it's easily and readily available for them. But students should definitely explore that free money to maximize that gift aid and minimize the amount that they may have to borrow. So sources of financial aid. Financial aid primarily comes from the sources that Daniel is putting on the screen now. The federal government, that is our FAFSA. That is, the FAFSA is required to be considered for any type of federal aid, including federal loans. So the federal government supplies grants such as the Pell Grant, which is probably the most known federal grant program, as well as our work study program. The federal government supplies the funding for that. Some of our other grant programs, as well as our federally funded student loans, direct loans, as well as the Parent Plus loan. State government, we talked about the Florida financial aid application that students do one time in their senior year. That application unlocks the student's eligibility or potential eligibility for the Bright Futures program. State government funds the Bright Futures program here in the state of Florida, as well as the Florida Student Assistance Grant and other grants available to students. So that is another funding source for students. Daniel talked about your college or your university, and that's multi-layered, as we talked about before. Some schools are going to look at all of their applicants to determine if those applicants are eligible for merit-based scholarships upon admission. Other schools are going to have an application process to be considered for merit-based awards. In addition to those incoming, what I would refer to as recruitment type of scholarships, there are also scholarships at the university or at the college where the student will find they do have to go through an application process to be considered through the foundation, through various colleges at a particular institution, through their departments. So students should find out whenever they get to a college or a university, what is the scholarship portal? How do I find scholarships here at this institution? Be connected with their college and their major so that they have the opportunity to see if they're college-specific scholarships. So it's really important for students to make those types of connections when they get to the institution of their choice. Community-based scholarships, private agencies are also a great funding source for students. We're talking about the Rotary Club, the Elks, Knights of Columbus. There are so many different organizations, church groups, fraternities, sororities that are out there that are providing students and families with the opportunity to receive awards, your church or synagogue. There are just so many places where students can find private scholarships. One of the things I will also share that I share with students a lot, and I would encourage you as guidance counselors to share with your students, is there is no scholarship too small, and scholarships are stackable. So scholarships give the students the opportunity, again, to reduce their likelihood of having to borrow. And so if it's a $250 scholarship from your church group, that's $250 that you're not going to have to borrow, or $250 that you're not going to have to find. And if you do that 4 times, you now have $1,000. So I just like to encourage students that it's really important for the student to look at a variety of different opportunities. No scholarship is too small. If you meet the criteria, put your name in the hat. And I encourage our guidance counselors to do the same with our student populations. And then we have professional associations, such as our association, Fafsa, and other associations that will provide students with scholarship opportunities. And then another way a student can look at sources of financial aid is looking at the student or the parent's employer. There are times when there are employment incentive programs to assist with educational expenses based on where either the student or the parent works. So starting your scholarship search, is there money out there? And the answer is absolutely. There's tons of financial scholarships available to students. And can I get any of it? Our students can. What I do say about the scholarship search process, it is one where tenacity wins. So the vast majority of students don't get all of the scholarships for which they apply. The vast majority of students get a small portion of the scholarships for which they apply. So the more applications the students are placing out there, the more likely it is the student will receive scholarships. Again, stackable, no scholarship is too small, looking at every opportunity as an opportunity to reduce their educational expenses. That's the mindset we want our students to have. We want to encourage them. We also want to help them be prepared. So in addition to the scholarship resume that I talked about, which is really just a bulleted Word document, I also tell students to have a few sentences, maybe a paragraph or 2 prepared that can be a skeleton for any essay they have to write. And I want to make it clear, they need to tailor the essay to whatever the scholarship application process looks like, if it is requesting an essay, but just some things that any donor may want to know about that student, the student's educational interest, their academic interest, any awards, accolades, or anything that they have done. And the reason why I tell students to do that is because sometimes you learn of an opportunity and there's not a lot of time to get everything in. And so you want them to maximize every opportunity and just be ready so they don't have to get ready. FastWeb is actually a really great tool. I often get students and families that ask if FastWeb is worth connecting to, and the answer is absolutely. FastWeb does give students literally the access to so many scholarship opportunities. And so students are receiving the information they need based on the profile that they've established, and it's going to be directly sent to their email address to share with them what exactly they are doing. Danielle, go ahead and chime in on.
Thank you. So thank you for that, Karina. On the blog, I talk about something you mentioned about sort of having your essay ready, and I use an acronym called POEM, P-O-E-M. And the idea, and I would highly recommend counselors use this with students to help students focus on what to write about. The acronym is that it means winnowing down. So you start with passion, P. What am I passionate about? What's the thing that drives me? O, opportunity. Where did I have an opportunity to express that passion? Was it a volunteer? If it's theater, was it my community theater? Was it a local production? If it's, working with children, was it when I volunteered at what was the opportunity? Experience is the E. What's the particular experience that I had that really connected back to my passion? And then the last piece is moment. What's the one moment that really captures that? And write about that moment. So the POEM is to help you winnow down from your passion to that individual moment where you can then tell a funding provider about your passion, because often the question's open enough that you can actually find a way to bring that moment back in. So sorry about that, but it is highlighted on the blog as sort of a way to help students winnow that down.
Right. And then the other thing is, I think that, we want our students to know that as Daniel mentioned, they want to stand out. So using that acronym to stand out and to shine and to tell their story really helps them to resonate with the individuals who have the opportunity to offer them the funding. Scholarships with essays have less applicants because it's more work. So again, encourage students to go through that process. And then just a reminder that each school has their own scholarship process, and the student really wants to become familiar with what is available at their institution and navigate that well. And we talked about students going through the scholarship process, and I mentioned students can start as early as middle school often to apply for certain scholarships. The other thing that I think that we can encourage students to do and plant the seed with students in high school is that the scholarship process doesn't stop in senior year either. It should continue throughout your college going experience. Those students can be very, very fruitful in getting scholarships sophomore, junior, and even senior year of college to, again, assist with those educational expenses. Next slide, please. So the financial aid calendar. So we talked about October 1. I can't drive home October 1 enough. It is right around the corner. And so on October 1st, the FAFSA for the 22-23 aid year opens. And that sounds nuts because I can't believe we're already here, but we are. Also, the CSS financial aid profile becomes available on October 1st. Depending on where the student is applying and the types of school for which a student is applying, there are some early decision deadlines. And so they want to go ahead and get those applications in, and they also want to get their FAFSAs in by the school's priority filing date. So they want to learn their school's priority filing date. During the months of November and December, they want to start to complete any forms that are being requested of them. If most schools have an interface where students are able to see any documents that school needs in order to continue the financial aid process. And so the student, once the student is in that system, is able to see what is required to continue the aid process. I encourage students to get those documents in as soon as possible to not delay the financial aid process. When it comes to the early decisions that some institutions render, those decisions are mailed in December, and students are notified of whether or not they have been admitted. And many schools have deadlines for when forms need to be submitted. Also, in late February, schools may have specific questions, but between February, March, and April, that's when students start to get more information about their admission status. Their financial aid award notifications go out. The award notifications are sent to students based on a few assumptions. So I do want to share that with our guidance counselor population, that when the students originally get their award notification sent by the institutions that they're attending, those award notifications are assuming that the students, in many instances, are going to be full-time students. They're going to outline the types of award the student will receive based on their full-time status. If a student is less than full-time, or if a student chooses to do something else in their college going experience, the financial aid package may be adjusted. So the financial aid package is sent to give the student an idea of what the student may qualify to receive. And then continue. We want our students to really look at their award letters, look at the net price calculators that we shared, because we want them to have an understanding of what their financial responsibility will be at the institutions that they're considering to attend. And that is, again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. So the student wants to look at housing costs at that particular institution. The student wants to look at the cost of tuition at that particular institution. The student wants to look at what that school is allotting them, for maybe other educational expenses. The student also wants to look at how much of their cost of attendance is being covered based on the resources that they're receiving in their financial aid package. So all of those factors helps the student to determine what is the best financial decision in terms of the college that they're considering. And that's not always the foundation of the decision the student is making, but we do want our students to make educated decisions when it comes to cost of college. May 1st is often the decision deadline, where students want to tell the institutions that they've applied to whether or not they're going to be attending those institutions. They want to pay their tuition deposits, which vary from one institution to the next. But if they're living on campus, there might also be a housing deposit. So they want to make sure they get those deposits in to secure their spaces and their seats. Depending on where they attend college, there may be a deadline for tuition established by that institution that is as early August. Students can start rendering payment once the bill becomes available, but students also want to become familiar with their school's policies and procedures as it relates to the fee payment deadline, and every school handles that slightly differently. Using UCF as an example, we do not drop any of our students who have any financial aid from their courses if they don't render payment by the originally established fee payment deadline. So a student, even if they had a $200 scholarship, that would be enough to defer their tuition to a later date in the semester and give the student time to render payment later. So the student does definitely want to become familiar with their school's policy and procedures as it relates to the disbursement of aid, the application of aid, and their fee payment deadline at their institution. The FAFSA and CSS profile become available just like that, October of the following year. And then in November and December, spring billing is out there for students to see and determine if they need to render payment based on their institution's policies and procedures. So what if you need more help? FAFSA.gov is a great place to just kind of get familiar with the FAFSA. And students are going to go here to complete the FAFSA electronically. Daniel, I'm seeing a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I hit by accident the FAFSA.gov link. So trying to launch that. So give me a second, we'll get there. I think the next item is the CSS link and just some of the other pieces. So up here.
Right. So
there we go.
We have the CSS profile, which is the profile from the College Board that many of our private institutions utilize to determine how they allocate their institutional resources. Finaid.org is a great website that just offers all around information. I think we all kind of go there as financial aid administrators to get information from time to time. Then Daniel has his wonderful blog full of great illustrations, and for those of us who are visual learners, ways to help us understand some of these complex financial aid information. And then each college has their financial aid office. And again, we're here to help. We're here to provide resources to our colleagues in the K-12 system, as well as to our students and our families. So we just want to be a resource and a tool for you to lean on and to help guide you through the process of guiding students. So some unique situations. We went through the reasons that make a student dependent for financial aid purposes, and it's typically based on the student's age, whether or not the student is married, whether the student has dependents, is the student a graduate student, a veteran, a ward of the court. There are very specific reasons and questions that are asked on the FAFSA that determine whether or not a student is considered a dependent student for financial aid purposes. And now let me say this, a student who is financially independent does not necessarily render them independent for financial aid purposes. However, there are times when a student has a more complex familial situation and the information on the FAFSA doesn't really capture that student's unique circumstance. So it could be that the student is an emancipated minor, is in a legal guardianship, is an unaccompanied homeless youth, or the student might have a complicated parental situation. In those cases, the student wants to reach out to the institution that the student is attending so that the student can look into what we call, in some cases, professional judgment. Some schools might refer to it as a special circumstance process. But when we're going through that process, what we're looking at is the documentation the student can provide and how we're able to take into account the student's unique circumstance and whether or not we can deem the student independent based on that information the student has provided. What I will share, I like to tell students when it comes to these unique circumstances, our special circumstances, our professional judgments, the student has to piece together the pieces of the puzzle for the institution. So the more information they can provide, the better understanding they can provide, the better outcome the student may have. Next slide, please. So what if I'm a citizen, but my parents do not have a social security number? We mentioned that Daca students do not qualify for federally funded aid, but that's the student. If a parent is either not a US citizen or is not an eligible non-citizen or is undocumented or lives out of the country, the FAFSA can be completed and the parent would indicate all zeros for the social security number, and that would allow the FAFSA to be submitted. What non-citizenship statuses are eligible for financial aid? So our permanent residents are of course eligible for financial aid, but we do have some other categories of non-citizens that are eligible to receive financial aid, and that includes our refugees, asylum granted. So if asylum hasn't been granted yet, that status does not qualify. So asylum granted, Cuban Haitian entrant, conditional entrant, parolee, anyone who holds a T visa, a battered immigrant, are residents of the Republic of Palau, the federal states of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. All of those particular non-citizen categories are eligible for federal aid. There are some limitations on certain categories for the type of aid for which they're eligible, but they can submit a FAFSA and their eligibility can be. So what is the difference between an eligible non-citizen and a Daca student? As we mentioned earlier, our Daca students are not eligible for federally funded financial aid. They want to explore other resources, private scholarships. I will tell you that it is a rare occurrence that a private scholarship has that specific requirement of a student being a citizen or an eligible non-citizen. A lot of times when it comes to private scholarships, the donor is just looking for someone who meets the criteria for which they are passionate. And so that would be one space that a Daca student can look for funding. The other space was the Dream US scholarship really is a great supporter of our undocumented students. So I would encourage a student who has a Daca status to look into the Dream.US scholarship. And I think I answered both questions with. So what if your situation has changed? And we're seeing more and more of this. The pandemic has definitely impacted many of our students and our families financially. And so professional judgment is the opportunity for a financial aid administrator to use a different base year to determine the student's expected family contribution or other factors associated with the student's educational expenses for that particular academic year. So what I mean by that is that we have students who have completed the FAFSA based on their 2020 information, but 2020 may not reflect the student's current situation. And this is not just based on the pandemic. We've always had the opportunity and the leverage as financial aid administrators to exercise our professional judgment. And so what happens is if a family may have experienced a separation or divorce, if unfortunately one of the parents is now deceased, if the parent has had excessive medical expenses or there was excessive paid medical bills in that family, or if there's a loss of income, loss of job, all of those things aren't going to be reflected on the FAFSA that's using 2 years prior information. So through the professional judgment process, we as financial aid administrators can take into account the family's current situation. And so this is another instance where the student wants to reach out directly to the institution the student is attending. Each institution has their own process for the professional judgment process. Next slide, please. So there are times when parents have just decided, I don't want to give you my information, I'm unwilling, and I do not provide you any financial support. In those cases, the student may do a process with their institution. And again, they want to reach out to that particular school's financial aid office because each school has a different process for how they may handle this process. If the student is not getting any financial support and their parents are unwilling to complete the FAFSA, the student could potentially be eligible to receive only the unsubsidized loan to assist with their educational expenses. And so the student wants to reach out to the school, share with the financial aid administrator what their situation may be, and then they will walk them through how that school handles the parental non-assist process. Next slide, please. And then we do have very unfortunate situation where a student may have been abandoned or abused or neglected. And we talked about some instances where the FAFSA just doesn't capture that familial situation. When the FAFSA does not capture the family's familial situation, we can do what is called a dependency override. The dependency override is what a student would do to say, my family situation is a little bit more complicated than the situations outlined on the FAFSA. I have documentation to support my familial situation. Often we're looking for documentation from a third party, such as DCF, a social worker. I know in our office, often we use mental health counselors because students have had to go through mental health counseling to navigate maybe the complexity of their familial situation, but someone who can attest to what the student has gone through. And then we can take into consideration that information to determine if the student may be considered independent for financial aid purposes. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pause. And I know there was at least one question in the Q&A and see if we can go ahead and get.
Yeah, the other piece, if I could just add, going back to the question about sort of the parent who refuses. So, I would also, with families in those conversations, I would differentiate between applying for a FAFSA and being required to pay for college. Often
Right.
that's sufficient, right? So there often is a concern that somehow by completing the FAFSA, I have obligated myself to help my kid pay for college. And that's not true. So often what I'll have a conversation with the family is I'll say, listen, parents, you may not be able to afford paying for college. That's a different question. It's kind of like applying for a mortgage and then signing the promissory note. When you apply for a mortgage, you're just checking to see whether you're eligible or not. You haven't actually obligated yourself to pay for anything. So sometimes that's sufficient. The other piece is there's a concern, and it was written on the slide, what if the parent doesn't want the student to see their information? Remember, if you use that IRS data retrieval tool, it comes over masked. So, that will protect some of that information from being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there are two questions that I would like to address. One is that a student was asked to move out because he turned 18. Is he considered homeless student? Both parents are attorneys. Is that at their discretion, or is he an unaccompanied homeless youth? And so through McKinney-Vento, the school can establish whether or not that student is deemed an unaccompanied homeless youth by the district. So I would put that into context. When the student has the McKinney-Vento unaccompanied homeless youth documentation from their district, that does assist the student with the information that they're providing on the FAFSA when they deem themselves an unaccompanied homeless youth. So that determination is actually made at the high school level. If by chance the student is not deemed an unaccompanied homeless youth and the student still has a complicated familial situation, the student could go through the dependency override process where they could then provide information and context and hopefully supporting documentation as to what their familial situation is. If there was maybe a reason for the student being displaced from the home, sometimes there's a lot more context than just, the parents put them out at 18. There might have been a lot of backstory. I don't want to assume, but there might have been a lot of backstory that got us to that point. And so those are the types of things that the financial aid office would need in order to render a decision if it was a dependency override.
And if I could just add, sorry to that, Karina, one of the challenges I think is that in our profession, it can appear that we're asking students to relive trauma, right? Because we're basically asking students to tell us about their most painful occurrences. And I just want to name that and say that we recognize that.
Absolutely.
And it's important for students to be completely transparent and fully descriptive because they need to let us know all of the information appropriate so we can make the best decision in their best interest. It's not out of period interest. It's because we have to document the case for auditors to say we had sufficient grounds to make this determination.
Correct. And I would definitely agree with that. And as financial aid professionals, I know myself and my team, we're very aware of the trauma that many of our students have lived and their lived experiences. And when I do have to request more information, I preface it with that. I let the student know I am aware that this may be a difficult part of your past or even your present or things that you're currently facing. But in order to have a better understanding of your situation, in order to understand how I can help you navigate your situation, I need more context. So to Daniel's point, that it is one of the more complicated aspects of the financial aid process, because we are dealing with very challenging situations at times. The next question I see is, a student is still waiting to hear where they will be accepted to college. Do they contact all of the colleges they have applied to share their special circumstance, or does the college wait to do the professional judgment process until the student has been accepted? What if the financial aid package is what helps the student decide on the school for them? Can they get the professional judgment decision without being accepted? I am going to venture to say it depends. It depends on the institution. So some schools, depending on their size, depending on their financial aid process, depending on their specific financial aid timeline, may only do that process for students who have been admitted. Other schools may be willing to do that process for students who are in the applicant pool and in the applicant line. Daniel, I don't want to speak for Valencia. At UCF, the student would be an admitted student at the institution before we start that process. Now, the student may not have committed to UCF, but they would have had to have been admitted at the university in order for us to consider beginning the financial aid process.
And I think that's the distinction, right? So yes, they would have to be admitted, because generally we're not preparing a financial aid award for someone who isn't admitted. But once they're admitted, then the next part of the process, the commitment, the sort of deposit, the yes, I'm coming, there is a window in there where we're clear the student's decision is based on that professional judgment. So I remember when I was at MIT, I worked at MIT as director of financial aid. Basically, from the time we mailed letters in the middle of March until May 1, we flipped and stopped doing awarding and did all appeals, because that was what was coming in, was basically appeals from families. And that was really our focal point during that period. So there are a couple of other questions that got raised, I think, during our session. One was addressed to Pete, and I know Pete had wanted to address this question live. It's a question about naming the Florida financial aid application versus the Fafsa. And Pete, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
Definitely. It is understanding that a lot of times high school seniors are receiving a lot of information, and we speak in a lot of acronyms. So that is one of the educational things that we want to always communicate, is that make sure that if your students do not understand a certain term or certain subject, they ask, because such things as Florida financial aid applications and the FAFSA, they are two different entities. They're two different applications, such as the student aid report, our SAR report, and the self-academic report are two SARs that students get confused with. So when it comes to high school seniors, we understand, but we also want to communicate the fact that this information needs to be clearly communicated to students. And if they don't understand, to please ask us. Now, that is how I wanted to address that situation. But also let me take this real quick minute to address something in regards to Bright Futures. Bright Futures, there's a lot of requirements for Bright Futures. One of the main requirements, and one of the things that we're seeing constant miscommunication on, is that in order for us at the Florida Department of Education, within the Bright Futures Department, to receive your qualifying test scores, those test scores need to be sent to one of the 12 state universities. That's one of the 12 state public universities. Therefore, we get them in the test depository, and we evaluate students for Bright Futures. It is also critically important that when we receive those test scores, we receive every sitting of those test scores, because that is how we super score it. I know the agencies now are providing a super score, but we do not receive information from that super score. We receive information from every sitting or every test that the student takes. Therefore, the student needs to make sure that they send it to one of the 12 state universities, even if they're not going to that institution. Now, in the era of COVID, we have expanded the actual deadline to submit test scores. And all students need to do is always send those test scores to one of the 12 state universities in order to be evaluated or reevaluated for Bright Futures purposes. So as of this year, the 2021-2022 high school seniors, they have until June 30th until further notice. Your 2021 high school seniors, they have until December 1st. And as long as we get those test scores before then, we will reevaluate them for Bright Futures eligibility. Thank you once again, guys, for your time.
Thank you. And just one thing while we're talking about Bright Futures, I know there was a question that came up about sort of Bright Futures versus Florida Prepaid versus Fafsa Aid. And I just want to say, because there can be confusion around this, Bright Futures and Florida Prepaid, they're based on how much tuition charge is, but they're not limited to pay only tuition. So people often get confused and think, what if I have prepaid and Bright Futures? Can I get both? And the answer is absolutely. Because, yeah, and please, right? Yes, because while they're both based on tuition amounts, they're not limited to only paying tuition. They can be, if there's excess, they can be refunded to help a family pay for other expenses, or they can be allocated to things like room and board or books or other, expenses that might be part of the family circumstance. So that's also helpful to know.
Pete, can you reiterate? I'm sorry, there's a question and I want to just make sure. Pete, can you reiterate that the Bright Futures evaluation is based on the test scores being sent to one of the SUS schools, not necessarily one of the state colleges? Can you expound on that?
That is correct. We at the Florida Department of Education, in order to receive test scores and evaluate test scores, the qualifying SAT or ACT test scores, need to be sent to one of the 12 state public universities. Even if, say, a student is going to Valencia, I would recommend them send it to UCF, even if they're not going to attend UCF, because that's how we're going to receive them now, and that's how we're going to evaluate the student for this year. And once again, every single test that they take, they need to communicate with either the College Board or the SAT, the administrators of those tests, and either have them sent there or resent those test scores by contacting those agencies so we can receive them on our end, because we at Bright Futures don't receive test scores directly. We receive them through them sending them to one of the 12 state universities.
So if the student did not select one of the 12 state universities, that student needs to contact either the ACT or College Board to ensure that they then include one of the state universities, and that information is sent that way so that that OSFA can get that information, correct?
That is correct.
Just want to reiterate that.
So I know there are a couple other questions we want to address. Can Bright Futures be used at any out-of-state college? No, really, it's limited to Florida colleges only. And that is true for most state programs. So if you're a Georgia resident, generally the Hope Scholarship can't move out of state either. State funding is really driven toward the state institutions, both public and private, but the state institutions that are within the state itself.
Daniel, do you mind expounding on how private institutions may receive Bright Futures funding if a student likes to go to a private Florida college?
Yeah. So if a student if a student's attending a private Florida institution, so private not-for-profit or private for-profit, there are programs in the state system that allow for funds, and specifically designated funds, to be given to students attending those institutions. So it may pay so I know, for example, the Florida Bright Futures program pays 100% of the four-year public cost. It won't pay 100% of tuition, but it will pay a sizable portion. So there's a ratio and a formula that's used to determine the amount. And again, that information can be found right on the Florida Financial Aid Office webpage. So a couple other questions that I'm seeing. So one is, when speaking with families that might be on the wealthier side, they don't understand why they need to do the FAFSA. So we talked about families that don't have a lot of income and assets. But here's a family that has a lot. They might not understand why they need to do the FAFSA, or if they're not going to qualify, why they should do the Bright Futures Florida Financial Aid application. Do you have an answer that you provide in conversations, Karina, to those families to encourage them to complete the application? What would you say to those families?
What I normally say to families is simply similar to what you said earlier, is the FAFSA is just an application. You're not making any commitment to anything. You're simply doing an application. If you only qualify for self-help aid, such as loans, you have to actively take those. So there's nothing that's going to happen to your financial aid. You're not tying yourself, binding yourself to doing anything. Another driving point that I use that often works well with families who might be on the fence with filing the FAFSA is the FAFSA is often required for certain private scholarships, regardless of whether or not need is the component. So that, to me, often is a light bulb for families. So if I could get free money, I'm not looking at the loans. And a lot of families know, they're like, I'm not going to qualify for anything but loans, we're not interested. Cool. That's fine. But there are going to be some scholarships that may not have a need component, but might have a FAFSA requirement in order for the student to be considered. So we definitely want our students to, again, maximize that good free money. Daniel?
Two other things I would add. One is, especially in this environment, who knows what tomorrow is going to bring? So you may be
Right.
doing great right now, but tomorrow there could be an income change, or who knows? So you're always better prepared to have it in and done just in case, right? I'm a just in case kind of person. I prefer to do it up front, have it sitting there to help me. And the second piece is, I would say, you talked about private funds, but often institutional funds. Like, just because you're not going to qualify for Pell Grant doesn't mean you might not qualify for other grants that are available. In fact, at Valencia, we have a grant that helps smooth out the Pell cliff, where a student stops receiving Pell. We have grant funds we give to students who are just barely above that Pell criteria.
Right.
And if you don't apply, you're not going to get it. So
Correct.
a question, and I don't know if you want to address this, I can if you don't, but what about people who are coming out of foster care? How do we help them get their tuition waiver and other kinds of assistance? And there are other tuition waivers I know that are available. So how do students qualify for those?
So at UCF, we do have a personal liaison on campus to assist our students who are aging out of the foster system. What I would share is that a lot of colleges and universities do have a landing spot for our students who are navigating aging out of the foster care system. So I would want our students to know that and to learn how they make that connection at their university or their college of choice, so that they have that support when they get to the institution. Our students who've aged out of the foster care system, they do receive a tuition waiver to assist with tuition and fees. They also are students who will qualify as independent based on the information provided on the FAFSA. So they often have very comprehensive financial aid packages in addition to the tuition waiver that they're receiving. Some of our students who have aged out of foster care, depending on some of the programs they may have participated in, I don't know if you see this a lot at Valencia, they may even have a Florida prepaid account that is associated with their college expenses, and we'll take that into account as well. So there are resources available for our students who are aging out of the foster care system, but I do think it's important for them to know where their home is when they get to that particular institution and how they navigate the complexities of being a student who's aged out of foster care and what resources are there to support them in that.
Great. I know there's a question, it looks like you wanted to ask or answer about Florida Prepaid and Bright Futures.
Correct. So I just, Daniel, you spoke about this a bit, but we get this from students and families, and often, how does Florida Prepaid and Bright Futures work together? And I once heard my director describe it as Pac-Man. So I liked that analogy. So Pac-Man is going through and they're eating all the little things in the cherries. And so we're going to call that whatever the student owes the institution. So if the student has a tuition debt and a housing debt, or a tuition debt, and depending on the school's book program, a book debt, or whatever they may have on their student account for that given semester, both Bright Futures and Florida Prepaid are acting as Pac-Man to eat at that debt. And so let's say the student has, and each school might have a different order. So at UCF, we start with the tuition debt. So the tuition debt is the first debt that we're going to tackle for the student based on whatever resources the student has available. So let's say a student has a Florida Prepaid plan, and Florida Prepaid plans, no Florida Prepaid plan, as someone who owns a Florida Prepaid plan, covers all of your students' tuition expenses. So I'm going to put that out there. So no Florida Prepaid plan will cover all of your students' expenses. So let's say you have Florida Prepaid. Florida Prepaid is applied to the student's tuition. The student has some remaining balance as it relates to what Florida Prepaid didn't cover. In comes Bright Futures. So Bright Futures, Florida Prepaid is Pac-Man and eating a big chunk and some cherries off of the tuition. Bright Futures is coming in to eat up the remaining balance of tuition. Let's say tuition is the only charge the student had on their account. They're not living on campus. They don't have any book charges. That student only had tuition. Then that student is going to be issued a refund of their Bright Futures and any other resources the student may have as a part of their financial aid package to assist with any of the educational expenses included in the cost of attendance. Those educational expenses include room, board, transportation to and from school. There's an allotment for personal expenses, all the things it takes a student to be a student and attend that institution. The student can utilize the refund towards that. Let's say the student has a housing charge. They're at an institution, they live on campus. So after the tuition has been tackled, that next charge, depending on the institution, could be housing. So then the remaining balance of the Bright Futures would go towards the next charge on the student account for that given semester. And we continue to just kind of eat away at the different charges the student has on the account. So they work in tandem, they work in conjunction. So a student does not have to render a decision to not use their Florida prepaid because they have earned Bright Futures. I hope that explains that well.
So I know we're running short on time. I'm going to offer, Katie, is there anything you'd like to add as we come to a close? Let me put you on the spot and see if there's any additional information you have that you'd like to share, or any things we haven't quite addressed that you'd like to add.
I think you guys have done a wonderful job addressing some of the bigger overarching concerns that a lot of students have when they sit down to complete the Fafsa and they don't know how to answer particular questions. One thing that I will point out that I don't think anybody mentioned is that when you fill out the Fafsa, there are built-in help texts. And honestly, all of those difficult questions, if you click on the help answer this question button, it will probably give them the answer. So sometimes it's just a matter of sitting down and actually starting the application and getting to the question that might stump you and clicking on the help box to be able to answer that question. So I wouldn't be afraid to start the process is one piece of advice that I would give families.
And I know we've done this in the past through Valencia. We'll do it again this year. And I know, Kathy, you may want to address this as well, but we'll do a walkthrough of question by question through the FAFSA. So this is really designed today to be more of an overview of the process, but there are resources available to you and to your students of the specific question by question walkthrough. But I think Katie's point is very valid. The other thing that we forgot to say, and Pete brought it up earlier, and this is where I thought you were going, when you do your FAFSA, a student will be sent something called a student aid report, which is actually a confirmation of what they've entered. And it allows the student to confirm and also make corrections as needed after the FAFSA has been filed. So Karina, Katie, any last words before we turn it back over to Kathy to wrap us up?
I just want to thank everyone. I know this was a long presentation, so I hope it was informative and useful and it helps you to help your students navigate this process.
And I add entertaining to that list of informative and useful. So Kathy, let's turn it back to you so you can bring us home and wrap this up.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Karima, and obviously Katie and all of the volunteers who are helping in the chat. So thanks so much. Thank you to all of you who shared questions. That's how we learn together. So really appreciate you doing that. We have a few upcoming things, so hopefully you found today super helpful. There will be a survey at the conclusion of this, so that's your opportunity to let us know what was particularly helpful, what you would love to see more of coming in the future. We do have, FCAN does have a webinar coming up on September 30th. It's part one of the Promise of Florida HBCU webinar series, and that one is called The Future So Bright, the Benefits of Attending an HBCU and the Positive Impacts on Future Career Choices. So we hope you'll join us for that. That registration is live. There's a few other webinars coming up behind that. So if you aren't already a subscriber on our list, I encourage you to do so. You can go to our website, floridacollegeaccess.org/subscribe to do so. If you're not already registered for the College Ready Florida initiatives, I encourage you to do that as well. That's how you hear about things like this and free resources we make available to you. So please register. Daniel, did you want to add something else?
Sorry, no, I was just seeing, I didn't know if it was me. I was having some internet issues, so I couldn't tell if it was your signal or mine. So
okay, no worries, no worries. One last thing on those supporting students aging out of foster youth. I know there are local resources available, and yet many times when we're talking to students who are transitioning out of foster care, I'm always surprised at how many times they don't know that those benefits are available to them. So communicate early and often with them, partner with your local community care-based agencies. Positive Pathways Florida also offers lists on their website. I believe somebody posted it in the Q&A, so that you can connect with your local college liaisons and university liaisons, as well as those community-based agencies. So let's make sure all of those students know that that aid is available. We will be repeating this same training on Friday. So if you have a colleague who was not able to attend today or has not registered, they can go to our website and register for Friday's session. Many of you asked if this is being recorded. It is. We will publish it on the Florida FAFSA Challenge page on our website, probably within the next couple of days. So you can go back and listen to this later. We will share the slides as all the presenters shared. And with that, it's 11 o'clock. Have a fabulous day. Thank you again for joining us today.